Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 2015, the gentleman from California, Mr. Honda, is recognized for 60 minutes as designated the Minority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address the ongoing horror and nightmare that is violence against women. Whether in times of conflict or disaster, too often we see the worst battles fought on women and girls' bodies. Tonight, Mr. Speaker, I am honored to recognize one woman who has survived unspeakable violence. She is a survivor. At 87 years old, she traveled all the way from South Korea. Her name is Lee Yong-soo, known to everyone as Grandmother Lee. She has become the voice of justice, peace, and reconciliation. In 1944, 16-year-old Yong-soo Lee of Taesegu, Korea, was lured by a friend of hers to meet with an older Japanese man. The man took the 2 of them and 3 other teenage girls by train, then shipped to Taiwan. There the girls were forced into sexual slavery, serving 4 to 5 Japanese soldiers every day for a year. Ms. Lee suffered beatings and torture, was infected with venereal disease, was fed paltry amounts, faced temperatures so cold that ice formed on her body. It was never allowed outside. Only the end of the Second World War brought her relief. Ms. Lee is just one example of the over 200,000 women from Korea, China, the Philippines, Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, Indonesia, and East Timor, who were kidnapped and sexually enslaved by the Japanese Imperial Army during World War II. These so-called comfort women suffered serious physical, emotional, and psychological damages as a result of their ordeal. Of her 200,000 sisters, Grandmother Lee is but one out of a handful of survivors from across Asia Pacific still alive. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was right when she reportedly called these victims, rather comfort women, sex slaves. When Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe addresses a joint meeting of Congress next week on April 29th, he has the opportunity to do right by these women. He can make a full, unequivocal, and formal apology on behalf of the Japanese government. The Prime Minister's visit is indeed a historic one. He will be the first Japanese Prime Minister to address a joint meeting of Congress. He will address this institution on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II and the 50th anniversary of the normalization between Korea and Japan. Prime Minister Abe will address this hallowed chamber where President Roosevelt delivered an address to our body as America entered war. There's much to be expected and anticipated in next week's address. According to yesterday's editorial by the New York Times, the success of Prime Minister's visit, and I quote, depend on whether and how honestly Mr. Abe confronts Japan's wartime history, including its decision to wage war, its brutal occupation of China and Korea, its atrocities and its enslavement of thousands of women forced to work as sex slaves of comfort women in wartime brothels. Mr. Speaker, in 2007, the House of Representatives sent a profound message to the government of Japan by passing House Resolution 121, which I authored. The resolution stated that it is the sense of the House of Representatives that the government of Japan, 1, should formally acknowledge, apologize, and accept historical responsibility in a clear and unequivocal manner for its Imperial Army forces' coercion of young women into sexual slavery, known to the world as comfort women, during its colonial and wartime occupation of Asia and the Pacific Islands from the 1930s through the duration of World War II. Two, would help to resolve recurring questions about the sincerity and status of prior statements of the Prime Minister of Japan, if the Prime Minister of Japan were to make such an apology as a public statement in his official capacity. Three, should clearly and publicly refute any claims that the sexual enslavement and trafficking of the comfort women for the Japanese Imperial Army forces never occurred, and should educate current and future generations about this horrible crime while following the recommendations of the international community with respect to the comfort women. And yet, the Japanese government has continued to fail to address this resolution. To be fair, the government of Japan has made important and appreciated efforts to face its history. In 1993, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono issued a statement saying the Japanese military was involved in establishing the comfort station. He said the women, girls really from Korea and elsewhere had been recruited against their own will. And this was based upon many documents. And in 1995, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, then Prime Minister Tomiichi Murayama admitted Japan's colonial rule and aggression caused tremendous damage and suffering to the people of many countries, particularly to those of Asian nations. In the hope that no such mistake be made in the future, I regard, in a spirit of humility, these irrefutable facts of history and express here once again my feelings of deep remorse and state my heartfelt apology. Yet in 2006, during Abe's first term as Prime Minister, he unleashed an international firestorm of criticism when he undermined the 1993 Kona statement, incorrectly alleging that no documentary evidence existed of Japan's complicity in setting up and running the comfort women's stations. There was, in fact, plenty of evidence, including the extensive personal testimonies of the survivors who spoke of being raped 10, 20, up to 50 times per day. In addition, many international bodies have issued recommendations and conclusions on Japan's history and actions. In 2003, the UN committee that evaluates Japan's compliance with the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment expressed concern regarding inadequate remedies for the victims of sexual slavery and violence, particularly survivors of Japan's military sexual slavery practice during World War II. This committee also recommended that Japan provide education to address the discriminatory roots of sexual and gender-based violence violations and provide rehabilitation measures to the victims. In 2008, the committee that accesses Japan's implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights concluded that Japan should accept legal responsibility and apologize unreservedly for the comfort women's system and take immediate and effective legislative and administrative measures to adequately compensate all survivors, educate students and the general public about the issue, and refute and sanction any attempts to defame the victims or deny the events. In talking about educating students, the textbooks in Japan still do not address the history of the military action in Asia during World War II. Following the passage of House Resolution 121, many countries followed suit and followed their own resolution: Taiwan, Canada, Netherlands, the European Union, and South Korea. Mr. Speaker, there's nothing more important right now than for a democratic country like Japan to apologize for its past mistakes. A government is a living, breathing organism that is responsible for its past, present, and its future. And yet, as the New York Times editorial said, history should have settled. History should have been settled that is not settled is largely the fault of Mr. Abe and his right-wing political allies who keep questioning history and even trying to rewrite it. Last year, I, along with 17 of my House colleagues, wrote to the Ambassador of Japan, to the U.S., calling the timing and context of the Japanese government report on the Kona statement regrettable, unfortunate, unacceptable, and destabilizing. Also last year, the Abe administration tried, and then failed, to get the United Nations to partially retract the authoritative 1996 report which called on Japan to apologize to the victims and pay reparations to the survivors who had been forced into sex slavery during the war. And most notably this year, the Japanese government tried unsuccessfully to try to change passages in a history textbook about the comfort woman during World War II. And I believe in the budget of Japan, Prime Minister Abe was able to secure almost $500 million to effect that kind of change wherever they deem necessary. Now, some say that Japan has apologized enough and it's time to move on. To those people, I would say, given these continued revisionist attempts, for every step forward toward peace and reconciliation, the government of Japan takes 2 steps backwards. Enough is enough. 70 years later, it's time for Prime Minister Abe to be clear and unequivocal and issue an irrefutable apology, something that carries the weight of his government. The German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, has urged Prime Minister Abe to face Japan's history. Germany knows something about this. After World War II, it engaged in a painful national coming to terms with the past that ripped open old wounds so that they could properly heal. In 1970, on a cold and wet day in Warsaw, then German Chancellor Willy Brandt laid down a wreath at the memorial of the Jewish ghetto. Then he fell to his knees in front of the memorial. As a reporter who witnessed this event wrote later, if this man, who wasn't responsible for the crime, who wasn't there in those years, now decides to walk through the former Warsaw ghetto and to kneel down, then it's clear he doesn't kneel there for his own sake. He confesses a guilt that he doesn't have to carry, and he asks for forgiveness that he himself doesn't need. Then he kneels there for Germany. And so, 70 years later, Grandmother Lee and the hundreds of thousands of souls of the departed continue to wait for their justice and peace. As someone who was put into an internment camp as an infant, I know firsthand that government must not be ignorant of their past. In 1942, during World War II, my country, my government, put aside the constitutional rights of Japanese Americans and systematically incarcerated thousands of us, 120,000. We were U.S. citizens, but we also looked like the enemy. Decades later, we, the Japanese American community, fought for an apology from our own government. In 1988, Congress passed, and President Ronald Reagan signed into law, H.R. 442, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Now, this was a formal apology to the United States citizens of Japanese ancestry who were unjustly put into internment camps during World War II. Our government made a mistake, but they apologized for it and healed many wounds as a result. Even though 40 years had passed, it still warmed my heart to hear my government say, "We're sorry." Japan must now do the same. They must show the maturity of a democratic country, apologize for their mistake, and thereby gain the trust of their sister Asian nations. Now, violence against women continues today. According to the World Health Organization, women aged 15 to 44 are more at risk from rape and domestic violence than cancer, car accidents, war, and malaria. By 1993, the Zenica Center for the Registration of War and Genocide Crime in Bosnia-Herzegovina had documented 40,000 cases of war-related rape. Of a sample of Rwandan women surveyed in 1999, 39% reported being raped during the 1994 genocide, and 72% said they knew someone who had been raped. As an estimated 23,000 to 46,000 Kosovar Albanian women are believed to have been raped between August 1998 and August 1999, the height of the conflict with Serbia. In 2003, 74% of a random sample of 399 Liberian refugee women living in camps in Sierra Leone reported being sexually abused prior to being displaced from their homes. In Liberia, 55% of them experienced sexual violence during displacement. And even today, the UN labeled the Democratic Republic of Congo as a rape capital of the world. There are rape camps that are destroying the lives of babies, young people, boys and girls, and women and men. In the DRC, 48 women are raped every hour. In addition, according to the recent Human Rights Watch report, the extremist group ISIL has carried out systematic rape and other sexual violence against Yazidi women and girls in northern Iraq. ISIS forces took several thousand Yazidi civilians into custody in northern Iraq's province in August of 2014, according to Kurdistan officials and community leaders. Witnesses say that fighters systematically separated young women and adolescent girls from their families and other captives and moved them from one location to another inside Iraq and Syria. The 11 women and 9 girls Human Rights Watch interviewed had escaped between September 2014 and January 2015. Half, including 2 12-year-old girls, said they had been raped, some multiple times, and by several ISIS fighters. Nearly all of them said they had been forced into marriage, sold in some cases a number of times, or given as gifts. The women and girls also witnessed other captives being abused. Violence against women must stop. Today, there are fewer than 100 surviving comfort women across Asia Pacific. Each year, this number declines. The survivors are dying by the day. They deserve that has been due to them for the past 70 years. They deserve the justice that's been denied them. These women want and deserve an official apology. In 1991, with the swift courage of Kim Hak-soon, she brought to light her story of being a sex slave to the Japanese Imperial Army. Her story was a spark that ignited the flames of justice. Since then, we have the courageous survivors, such as Grandmother Lee, who continues to be a voice for the voiceless. We also have the courage of Ms. Jan Ruff O'Hearn, who now resides in Australia. Ms. O'Hearn was born in Java, in the former Dutch East Indies, known today as Indonesia. When she was 19 years old, Japanese troops invaded Java. They were interned in the Japanese prison camps. 2 years later, she was selected along with several other girls. It was told by a Japanese military that they were there for the sexual pleasure of the Japanese military. As Ms. O'Hearn relayed during the 2007 House Foreign Affairs hearing on protecting the human rights of comfort women, she said a Japanese officer ran his sword all over her body and forced himself on her. The trauma these women, these girls endured is unimaginable. That is why my patience for securing justice for the dignity of these victims is running out. The opportunity to speak to a joint session of Congress is an honor that is reserved for the heads of state of our closest allies. Now, it is my sincere hope that for Ms. O'Hearn's sake, for Kim Hak-soon's sake, for the grandmother's Lee's sake, Prime Minister Abe will take the privilege to address the joint meeting of Congress and finally and firmly apologize and commit to educating the future generations honestly and humbly. The spirit of these women, these girls, deserve no less. And in closing, I'm going to quote Grandmother Lee's comments when she testified before our subcommittee in 2007. She said, "If you cannot apologize to me, Give me back my youth. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.